We have a fine panel for you today. We're going to talk about their research, and I hope ways that you find fascinating and interesting, as fascinating as I do, as I've had a chance to talk with them all. So that you get a chance to hear our panelists right off the bat, I'm going to ask them to do their own introductions right from the start, and then we'll go into having our first speaker.
Hi, everybody. I hope that you'll be able to hear us well. My name is Dr. Anna Babbitt Rosario. I've joined DU's Daniel's department, Daniel's College of Business last fall as a faculty in the marketing department. And I'm looking forward to talking about research with everybody.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Sperber, and I also started at DU this fall, but I'm in the political science department, and I study comparative African politics for the most part, but I'm going to tell you about a very different project today, which I'm excited about.
I'll speak. Got her.
Hello. My name is Michael Brent. I'm in the Department of Philosophy. I've been here at DU since 2014. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think philosophical research might be and some of my own interests. And I really hope you'll jump in and ask questions immediately, if you have any, if that's okay. And we'll have a really great conversation. So off we go.
And I'm Barry Zink. I've been at DU much longer than everybody else at this table, which scares me a lot. But it doesn't seem that long to me. It's 2006 is when I started, and I'm from the Department of Physics and Astronomy, and I'm an experimental condensed matter physicist. We do a bunch of cool stuff in my group in terms of research, and I'll tell you a little bit about that and what the motivations for doing that are and why it's important to me and how important writing is to all of that.
So thank you, and we will have time for questions, so if you have them, hold on to them too. We'll have a time when you'll be able to ask anybody on the panel and all the way across to at the end. So we'll start with our first speaker, Dr. Brent.
Thank you. Hello. Again, nice to see you all here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to say a little bit about what I think, idiosyncratically of course, is at stake in philosophical research in general as a discipline. And then I'm going to try to say a little bit about the methods that philosophers typically use when they're doing their research and why they might be important. And then I'll talk a little bit about my own particular current research projects. And then I'll stop in about 10 minutes. Okay, so at stake in philosophical research, I think, and I might be wrong, is everything. The whole kit and caboodle. Philosophy, as a discipline, asks questions about everything that human beings could possibly inquire into. So in a way, the subject matter is endless. But more particularly, I think, and again, you might get a different answer from a different philosopher, I think what is really at stake in philosophical research is the pursuit of truth. Multiple types of truths. So for example, in a philosophy class, you might ask questions about whether God exists. You might ask questions about what's right and wrong, what's the nature of goodness. You might ask questions about human knowledge, what it is, how do we get it. You might ask questions about what kinds of objects exist. So are triangles the same type of object as this material object right here? Puzzling questions like that. But all of them, I think, are aiming toward trying to uncover truth. Truth in the deepest possible sense. Truths that might be independent of us. Truths that might obtain whether human beings exist or not. Now, if that's what's at stake in philosophical research, namely everything and all the possible truths that there might be, what kind of methods do philosophers use to typically get at this truth? Has anyone here taken a philosophy class or is in one of my classes? I haven't seen all of you. Yes, okay, not that many. That's very good. So what methods, as in I could tell you something that you might not know. So what methods do philosophers use? Well, what's the sort of stereotype that you might have of the philosopher? Nerd, of course, I'm wearing glasses. Awesome. No, seriously, thank you, David. What might be the stereotypes that you have of philosophers? This is where you can actually say something, if you want. What's the stereotype? What do they do? What do they look like? What's the stereotype? They're dead. So most of them are dead white dudes, it's true. They don't have a real job. That's definitely true.
They really like to talk.
They really like to talk. Thank you, Elizabeth. That's also very true. They question everything, right? That's where I was going. The way I was raised to think of philosophers before I fell in love with the discipline and started thinking about doing it as a career, I thought of it as someone whose head is lost in the clouds. This is in Theaetetus. Thales, the astronomer, he's thinking about astronomy and he falls into a ditch because he's not paying attention to the world in front of him, right? Or you might think of Rodin's, the thinker, le penseur, that statue, right? If you've seen this image of the man sitting there thinking, doing absolutely nothing, and just sitting around and asking big questions. In fact, so that's a stereotype that I think is in part true, because a lot of what philosophers do and in their methods by which they conduct their research is, in fact, sitting around and thinking. They sit around and think, but they also engage with texts. So I think here I represent, for the Writing 1133 course, the text-based argumentative sort of research strategies. And so indeed that's true. Philosophers typically read written work, some of the dead dudes from before, mostly they're dudes unfortunately, and they write in ways that are trying to argue in favor of a thesis that they think is true. So the methodology, though, in philosophy is not limited to text-based argumentative inquiry. I would suggest that philosophers now are truly interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary in their scope. So that means they draw on methods from across the university. They don't just sit around and read and write. They also go out into the world, make observations, and do things that we'll hear a little bit about perhaps, that overlap with other research traditions. I'm happy to say more about that in a second, or later on. So, these methods, I think, are important and useful if we think that the pursuit of truth itself is important and useful. I think that, in fact, we do. That's why we're here, hopefully getting an education. But I will see, actually, I'll leave this open. I want to see how the philosophical method or the method in the humanities actually is distinct from the scientific method of inquiry and in the social and natural sciences. I hope we can talk about that soon. To see what might, if anything, be the distinction in methodology and why the philosophical method is important in and of itself. Okay, last point, a little bit about my research and what excites me. So, right now I'm thinking about the question of whether thinking is itself an intentional action that you perform. So, right now, I'm presuming hopefully you're awake and listening, and you're receiving information from me in some sense. And that's a passive reception of some sort of perceptual experience that you're having. But what I'm wondering is if thought, thinking about, for example, what you want to eat for dinner tonight, or trying to reason your way to a conclusion, whether doing that can count as an intentional action, something you're performing purposefully, in the same way as, for example, walking to the store with your body might be an intentional action that you perform in that regard. And in fact, it turns out it's really tricky to say whether thinking is something that you're doing intentionally. There's a lot of pressure from the neuroscientists, the psychologists, and where they overlap with philosophers, there's a lot of pressure from those disciplines that seems to suggest that thinking is merely automatic, reflexive, responsive to the stimuli in your environment around you, and there's no genuine sense in which when you're thinking about something, you're literally doing something. And so my current research is trying to figure out a way in which we might articulate an account of action that pertains to thinking, so that we can say, when you're thinking, you're doing something, not merely sitting around and letting things happen. So that's the
Michael.
rough topic of my current interest. Yeah.
You asked us to interrupt you
Please,
with questions.
yes.
Can it be both perceptual and instinctual in some situations and not in others?
Absolutely. So thinking can be both active and passive in certain regards and in certain contexts. But I want to try to focus on what would happen, what makes it unique when it's uniquely active. So yes, experience is both passive and active. But there seems to me to be reason to believe that there are some instances of thinking in which you're legitimately doing something. So here, let's do something quickly together. 1 second. Okay, I'll give you 2 premises in an argument, and you'll say out loud the conclusion. Okay? So, all human beings are mortal. Okay? That's number 1. Socrates is a human being. What's the conclusion? Yeah, way to go, DU. Exactly. What you've done there is a verbal performance of the same thing you could do without verbalizing it. And I suggest there are cases in which, when you're doing that sort of thing internally and silently within your head, you're actually performing a kind of mental action, a cognitive performance of some kind for which you can potentially be held responsible. in the same way that you could be held responsible for your bodily actions. So I'm trying to provide a framework that encompasses both types, perhaps in a unified way. And what unifies my research, last point, is the notion of effort. So I'm interested in what it is to exert effort in doing the things that you do, especially in the cognitive domain. So trying hard to pay attention to something while you're in the library, while you're in the Anderson Academic Commons, and there's a lot of noise happening around you, and you have to actually read something. In those kind of moments, I think it takes a lot of effort on your part to pay attention to what you're reading and to do the thing you're trying to do cognitively. So that's the theme that runs through my current research, is if we can make sense of effort and its role in the things that we do cognitively as thinkers. There was a question, and then I'll sit down.
How do these active versus passive thoughts fit into deterministic views?
That's a good question, and I'll run away right now because I don't have a good answer. No, the determinism question is entirely separate. That is a very fair question. The determinism question is entirely separate from what's going on here. As in, determinism may or may not be true. We might have to figure that out talking with physicists and mathematicians. But we can still look at, independently of what caused you to do the thing you're doing, independently of the question of determinism, are there cases in which what you're doing is in fact performing an intentional action? So I think they could be two distinct questions, the question of determinism and action. But that's a great question. So, I think at this point I will pause and stop and turn it over to the next speaker, and we'll continue going with this. So thank you for your time. Too many minutes.
So I rarely use backgrounds in my slides, but today I did, and it happens to match the wall. Okay, so let's see. Okay, great. So I have a slightly different style presentation, perhaps a function of my being in a very different cousin discipline. But what I want to talk to you about today is not my own research with a kind of capital R, the stuff that I presented to get a job here, but some very real research that I was able to conduct this winter quarter with my class, one of the classes that I taught. And that project was supported by CECL, which is the Center for Community Engagement and Service Learning here at DU, which is a small but mighty and really wonderful part of DU. So if you haven't visited them, I suggest you do. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a comparative politics scholar. I'm in the political science department. And this talk that I'm giving now, I guess you could call it something like community engaged research about life after prison in Colorado, or a more honest title might be like how I taught the truly dreaded undergraduate methods course in political science in partnership with a local community organization called the Second Chance Center. So a little bit of context. I have worked on community-engaged research, both here in the U.S., especially before graduate school, and abroad, by which I mean research that tries to involve community members or organizations in the design, implementation, and reflection on research products, right? I've used mixed methods. For lack of time, I'll say that, I've used often sort of had problem-driven approaches to methods. So depending on what the problem is I want to study, I'd figure out what the best methods are, and I try to teach them to myself. This has worked better sometimes than others, but that's the idea. And another part of my job here, aside from being a researcher, is also teaching, right? And so this winter, it was my turn in the department to teach our required social science methods course, which happened to be at 8 a.m. in the winter in a windowless room. And I don't like to do things that feel meaningless. And if I was going to have to teach this class and students weren't going to want to be there, that seemed like it might stink. So I thought about ways that might sort of make it more interesting and impactful, and in collaboration with Cecil, decided to try to have a two birds with one stone kind of thing, hence the two birds. I'm not actually studying birds, but basically trying to make this class a more community engaged and sort of active research-based class, right? So when we talk about community engaged research and teaching, here's sort of one way of thinking about it. It's research and teaching that aims to enhance academic learning through reciprocal relationships with communities that offer opportunities to advance critical thinking, develop civic skills, and address public problems. We could spend a long time talking about what those terms mean, but I'll leave it at that for now. So all that said, what are we going to research? What type of community group are we going to look to? And so I got to make this decision before the class started, because that's when preparation for this has to begin. And I chose to try to focus our efforts on criminal justice issues. And in general, I think mass incarceration is clearly one of the major kind of civil rights crises of my generation, and unfortunately also of yours. And don't have much time to get into it, but if you don't know Michelle Alexander, I highly recommend her book, The New Jim Crow. And I think this gives you sort of a flavor of some of the conversation about mass incarceration politics in the social sciences, when she says that the nature of the criminal justice system has changed. It is no longer primarily concerned with the prevention and punishment of crime, but rather with the management and control of the dispossessed. Again, constraints on time, you're going to have to take my word for it, but there's a whole lot of evidence out there that tells us that there are systematic barriers to reintegration into society after people are released from prison or other sort of forms of incarceration. In Colorado, over the last several years, the recidivism rate, meaning the rate at which people who are released from an incarcerated circumstance and then end up going back to prison usually, is anywhere between 35 and 49%, which means basically 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 2 people who are getting out of jail are going to head back there, right? Which is, it's terrible. It's a terrible outcome for everyone. This has to do partly with discrimination in housing, employment, access to healthcare and mental health care, right? And another thing I want to emphasize here is that in addition to all of that evidence, we know that we don't have great models for what to do about it. We lack, what in fields as diverse as sociology and social work, as well as political science and policy studies, we talk about as sort of models for social programs, right? We don't have very good ones when it comes to community reintegration, a la the recidivism rate. But we had an opportunity in my class to work with a really extraordinary and unique organization that has grown very rapidly in recent years, and called the Second Chance Center, or the SCC for short. And what makes it so unique is that it was founded and run by felons. In policy circles, policy wonks love to talk about evidence-based policy. And usually that means people who have degrees in something sit around a table and come up with a model. And in this case, these are evidence-based models based on the evidence of people's own experiences and lives. And so in particular, it's impossible to talk about the SCC without introducing you to Hassan Latif, who is one of the co-founders and the executive director, and who also sits on a broader body here in Colorado that's working on criminal justice reform. He was released in 2006 after 18 years of prison here in Colorado. By 2012, he had written a book called Never Going Back, 7 Steps to Staying Out of Prison. He co-founded the Second Chance Center, as he would say, first as a mobile unit in his car, basically just trying to assist people that he'd known in prison, or people who knew prison he knew in prison, who were getting out and needed help with all kinds of things. And he and his network started trying to actually organize some resources for that, using this book largely as a model. And by 2016, 4 short years later, this organization is now a formal 501c3, has a big building in Aurora, and employs a sizable staff, and is routinely referred to as Colorado's preeminent reentry organization. So with that kind of really rapid growth history in mind, they had just actually embarked on their first kind of formal, hiring research consultants to come in and figure out what surveys to do and try to track, progress and impact in the organization over time. They had just embarked on one of those when I met Hassan with this, sort of goal of figuring out how my class might be able to do something of mutual interest with the SEC. But in talking with him about it, he said, this is great, we need to do it, I'm glad we're doing it, but this survey-based work, I don't know, I really want to try to capture some of the intangibles, some of the stuff that makes this place unique, some of the relationships that really matter to people here. I'm not convinced those surveys are gonna do that. Which was music to my ears. Oops, sorry. Because the one of the methods that I really love and that I love teaching to undergrads or people who haven't done a whole lot of research before is qualitative analysis. I think it can be much more intuitive, and there's sort of lower barriers to entry in terms of the software that you use. And so we talked about how we could do a mostly qualitative study to try to get at some of those intangibles. So what did that look like? It meant that basically during the first part of the winter quarter, while I was teaching sort of, some of these basic methods in my class, I was also privileged to work with 2 PhD research assistants that Cecil helped me hire and pay to go to the SEC and conduct focus groups, basically group interviews with clients who are at the SEC. And we were able to do this with a random sample, which is very exciting to social scientists. I'm happy to talk about that more if you want. We held 5 of these groups with 7 to 10 clients in each group. And we held the groups within the SEC in a secure, quiet conference room. And then those research assistants actually transcribed verbatim those conversations that had happened in the room with us. And that enabled us to, to spend the second half of the quarter in the classroom working through these transcripts, which didn't have anyone's real name in them, it's a Joe or Sally, whatever. But it did, have this whole deep, intense conversation, 5 of them actually, spelled out there on the page. And so my students did the really hard work of, going through all of those documents many, many times and trying to code them, trying to come up with a consensus, sort of bringing their coding to class and sitting in small groups and then in a larger group about what they saw, what they read there in terms of how the participants were making meaning or were explaining what was meaningful to them about their engagement with the SEC, as well as the broader challenges that they face in reentry, the things that they want SEC to continue helping them with, right? So yeah, lots of deliberation and consensus building in the actual classroom. And then the sort of end result of that was that we had this amazing, very powerful class presentation to SEC staff upstairs in the glass box room at the end of the quarter. And each student got up and presented a few slides in a sort of arc of slides that the students had helped organize together in class with me. So here's one of the students and one of his slides. You can see what he's talking about here is something that the participants in the group often referred to as a DOC mentality, meaning Department of Corrections or sort of prison mentality. And what does this mean? Well, let's look. Here are some quotes from folks in the different groups we ran. Someone said, they're like, we don't care what you think. We think for you, talking about the staff in the Department of Corrections, right? That living for years in an environment where that's literally something someone would say to you. Another person said, the difference is the whole thug mentality where, I have to smash this guy out. It doesn't work that way outside of prison. And by that, he meant, this is sort of a common thing that came up, but basically, to survive in prison, you have to adapt to be really tough, right? If someone bumps your shoulder, you punch them in the face. So it's a preventative measure, it's an adaptive behavior so that you are protected and safe in prison, right? But you get out of prison and somebody bumps you on the street and you punch them in the face, you're gonna get sent back to prison, right? That's no longer an adaptive or helpful behavior. And so the transition, aside from trying to find housing and a job, involves things like this, right? Sort of getting used to a new way of thinking and being. And another participant said, they bank on that, meaning the DOC. Us going out and thinking that mentality and coming back to prison, that mentality as the kind of trap, right? So James did a really nice job trying to tease that out. And in the report, we sort of tease that out. What we are kind of most excited about is how this report then gets used, right? And how the presentation ends up having an impact. And I can say just to my surprise somewhat, the presentation actually had a bunch of people in tears, including Hassan, who came in his Sunday best. There he is. And one of the things that happened at that presentation was just a kind of realization among lots of different people about having reached some kind of new understanding of each other and where they're coming from. And for Hassan in particular and some of the other staff, that was really meaningful. And, the sort of more nuts and bolts things moving forward are that the final report, which I'm editing now with one of those research assistants, is going to be a document that these very hardworking, busy guys and ladies can use to not only sort of inform their decisions about the services that they provide and what they invest more in, et cetera, but also as they apply for grants and to get more funding, they can take some of their clients' own words out of this report to try to help other people understand understand what's needed and why, which is awesome. And you know, at the sort of largest aggregate level, they continue to advocate for policy reform. They've worked in a coalition with a bunch of organizations that have actually had some success at the state level here in Colorado, and being able to bring something that really has the words of folks who've been through this as part of their explanation to policymakers about why certain changes are needed is hopefully a powerful kind of evidence. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited about your questions.
Who's next, me?
Yeah.
Let's see here. So we're here. And is there full screening somehow? All right, close enough. Hi, I'm Barry Zink. It's been interesting to listen to you guys so far, and it reminded me of two movie quotes. So the first one, I'll paraphrase a little bit, one of my science heroes who said, paraphrasing, this is going to be a talk about science if you're interested in truth. Professor Brent's class was just a few minutes ago, of course, and who was that? We'll see how old I am and how not old you guys are. Nobody knows? It's Indiana Jones, right? In Raiders of the Lost Ark. This is a class about archaeology, if you're interested in which is about fact. If you're interested in truth, then Professor somebody's philosophy class is just on that. Okay, never mind, that didn't go over. The second movie quote is now for something completely different. Which is not completely different, because research is definitely, there's going to be a core similarity to a lot of this. But I'm a physicist, I'm an experimental physicist. So a physicist is somebody who thinks about matter and energy in very fundamental terms. An experimentalist is somebody who does something in the world and observes it and tries to understand what happened. And so that's what we do here on campus and working with lots of collaborators across the world. So writing and research in experimental condensed matter physics and nanoscience, most of the things that we study and that I'm interested in happen at sort of small scales, so that's what the nanoscience thing is about. This is an awful lot of words just about sort of the very basics about my research lab. I'm not going to go through all this sort of stuff, except I do want you to notice how many different people are involved, and that's really great. It takes a lot of money to pay the people to do all this work, and so I have to thank the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy for supporting this in various ways over the years. And there's all sorts of things on this that have to do with writing, and I'll specifically call that out here in a little bit. But I also have to thank all these people who are the ones mostly in the lab doing all the actual stuff I'm going to talk about. Lately, I do way more writing and reading writing and then reporting on reading writing than I do actually getting to do all the cool stuff in the lab that you'll hear a little bit about. So here's just two, and to inform a little bit about the stakes of our research, I just wanted to highlight two of our ongoing projects. The thing on the left there, we're interested in basically understanding how to make a thermal battery. It's a way of energy harvesting that could potentially contribute to moving more toward green energies and carbon-free energy generation and helping reduce the temperature of the planet in some long-term sense, which is, I think all of us probably understand is a valuable thing to think about. So specifically, that's using carbon nanotubes as thermoelectric generators, and we work with collaborators at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory over in Golden to do that work, and it's really fantastic. And if we're lucky, we get to write fancy papers like the one that came out in Nature Energy last year, and that's really cool, and again, there's writing. The thing on the right, you may or may not know it, but the computers that we're all using right now, in one way or another, right, either to view the stuff on the screen or all of our cell phones, everything else, are already limited in terms of their performance by heat because of a huge amount of electron currents that flow around in them. And so we're interested in trying to come up with a way around all that heat that's generated by the electron flow. And we're interested in then trying to use a different property of the electron to transport and store information, which physicists called spin. And it's basically an angular momentum of the electron. And so we study spin currents in materials over a whole broad range of different things. And then again, specifically how heat affects those spin currents. So Those are two different projects, and of course, the thing on the right could hopefully lead to better computers and more energy-efficient computers. The thing on the left is also related to how we use energy and how we could use energy more efficiently. So there's a real theme of how we use energy and the consequences of that. Okay, what's my next slide? So when it comes down to it, though, how do we actually do that, right? I'm an experimental physicist, so we have to actually go into the lab and do stuff, and then see what happened, and then we can write about it afterwards. And hopefully we understand what happened before we write about it, but that doesn't always happen. And so what do? We get things really hot. Often if we want to make a new material, we have to boil some metal or semiconductor or insulator using a huge stream of electrons that we blast into it. And then we form a film by basically sticking something into the vapor stream, right? So we get things really, really hot. We get things really, really cold because we like to study a wide range of different properties and different ways that they change. So we often get things down to even below, well below 4 Kelvin. So that's liquid helium temperatures, something that's like basically the temperature of deep space, and we go colder than that to try to understand the fundamental nature of things. And we get things really empty to do both those things. Often you can't have a bunch of air hanging around, and so you have to suck all the air out of your vacuum chamber or whatever. And what's not listed here is, sadly, we get to do a lot of stupid stuff like plumbing, because you got to there's some machine that makes something extremely cold, but it gets hot in the process of making it really cold, so you've got to put water through it to make sure it doesn't melt. And we do a lot of that kind of stuff too. So this is what happens when you don't just get to think about it, but you have to actually make it happen in the real world first. And so that's a big part of what we're doing. So I don't mean to, well,
Thanks, Barry.
we just got to liven things up a little bit. If we don't get a little friction here, it's gonna. I'm gonna bring up an MRI later, maybe too, and then I'm
You have
really
a
gonna piss
philosophical
you off.
question on your slide. Getting things really empty. So
Yeah.
You're on my turf now.
Oh, see, but you're always on my turf, man. That's the thing. So, any case, that's the sort of things that we do. But just to give one little note about writing, and then I'll conclude. I have no idea how long I've talked at this point. None of this matters. None of the things that we do in a lab, none of the things we find out about the way the universe works matters at all unless we can write them down, and in a way that we can convince people that what we've done is correct, right? So that's the issue. There's a lot of talk in the public sphere now about science and peer review and things like that. Well, peer review doesn't just happen by calling up some peers and saying, hey, I measured spin transport in an amorphous material in my lab. It's freaking cool and it's right. And I'd say, oh yeah, that looks pretty good to me. That's not the way it works, right? We have to write 5,000 words and 5 or 6 different diagrams and put it all together and make sure it's really a very, very strong argument based on the things that we've measured. And then we send it to a journal, and they send it out to blind reviewers, people who maybe you know, maybe you don't know, but aren't going to say who they are, so they can give a thoroughly unvarnished, totally honest opinion, not only on what you've done, but also how well you've argued that in the paper that you write, right? So it doesn't matter how good the science is, if you can't write about it effectively, you're kind of stuck. And so we do a lot of writing, and of course, even before writing the paper, you've got to get money to pay the people to do the science to write the paper. And to do that, guess what? You have to do more writing, and you have to do the same sort of extremely convincing, totally exciting types of writing in order to get people to give you money to do new things, to find something out about the universe. So there's all sorts of other writing that you have to do, which is maybe less exciting to talk about, but it's essential. It's 80% of the things that I do have to do with writing. So even though what I'm really interested in is how the world works and finding out new things about the universe, most of what I do is writing and reading other people's stuff. So I'm fine with that because I like to write too. But okay, final thing on stakes of research. So yeah, Professor Brent said stakes of research are everything. This is my way of saying that's actually true for physics too. We're trying to answer fundamental questions and create new knowledge. And what we're really trying to do, there are some physicists who just care about the fundamental stuff and like, ooh, I've proven that you can have a particular type of magnetic order in a non-square lattice. And like, there are people that get really excited about stuff that is a bit esoteric. The things that excite me most are when I have a piece of physics that has a direct application to solve one of the grand challenges for society. So the sorts of things that I mentioned before, how are we going to generate energy in a clean way? How are we going to make a computer more efficient so we don't waste so much energy just using it, doing our computations that we have to do? Those are the things that get really exciting to me. The other thing that's really exciting to me is educating people. Otherwise, I would probably be a scientist somewhere outside of a university. But trying to educate not just you guys, but also the people working in my lab and training them on how it is you put an experiment together. What do you need to think about? How do you interpret something when you've got the data? How do you make the plumbing work when everything breaks and you've got to make something out of nothing? So that part is extremely exciting to me. And connecting people is also exciting. So that's a nice thing to have opportunities to do things like this where we get to talk to a bunch of different people. So I can stop right there. Thank you. Unless you have questions. Any questions now? I don't know how we're going to do this.
All right. So hi, everybody. Thank you again for joining us today. Another fourth, very different presentation from everything you've seen. My name is Babbitt Rosario. If by any chance you're wondering about my heritage, I come from a country that is King's Landing. So for any fans of the Game of Thrones show, it's Croatia. It's Dubrovnik. My story is a little bit different. I joined EU because of research. I stand here before you because I was able to be a good marketer, visualized my data well, hopefully well enough, and I wanted to show you some examples of that. Just a little bit about the type of research that I do, and I do plenty, which is confusing and dangerous for my reputation, and I'll tell you why. Epistemologically, I believe that there is an undeniable truth with a capital T. I also believe, however, that there are situations where we're social animals. I believe that we sometimes socially construct phenomena. And so because of those varying beliefs, I use different methods, which makes it very dangerous. It's dangerous because if I claim that I'm an expert in quantitative research as well as qualitative research, I might be perceived as the jack of all trades and an expert in none, right?
She's right.
So, however, I do like difficult paths in my life, so this is something that I do. So just a little bit about the topics that I research. I am a marketing scholar. Some of the things that really interest me are how do ratings on Yelp and other social media affect companies' performance, and they do. Spoiler alert. How do companies consumers share their ideology? So if somebody goes gluten-free, how adamant are they in promoting that lifestyle to other folks? So as you can see, very different questions, right? Some of the data that I have relied on as evidence in my research include interviews, include netnographies, which are ethnographies done online. So I go to blogs and I go to different online communities and I look at what people write and make my conclusions based on that. I also am engaging in experimental research, right? Because I do believe that we, as humans, react to certain stimuli in our environment in a particular way. I've also participated in some projects where I've used only secondary data, such as bibliographic and citation analyses, meta-analyses, right? What attracts me to research? I like to answer questions that personally I find puzzling. I like to advance the knowledge in my discipline, and I also like to settle debates. And for that, a meta-analysis has been a tool that has been very useful in my work. So again, as you may see, like Professor Brent,
What's meta-analysis?
What's meta-analysis? Good question. A meta-analysis is a type of research where we're a little bit lazy and we rely on other folks' research, right? If there is a discussion in the field, right, And there's a debate and different camps that people kind of can't wrap their heads around a particular phenomenon. They claim X is true and Y is true. A meta-analysis is a very useful tool where you can take all of the evidence, all of those published papers, and do statistical analyses, quantitative analyses, to figure out, okay, what is true? What is true with a capital T, right? So an example of meta-analysis and why it's been useful recently is in the case of autism and its link to vaccinations, or the other way around. So there has been quite a bit of discussion on this controversial topic, and a meta-analysis was used to determine that there's actually no link between vaccinations and autism, right? So as you may see, I also, like Professor Brent, use mixed methods, use multiple methods, which I explained might be just a little bit dangerous because of the way researchers are perceived. And we also had a really good question in preparing for today's talk, and that was, what is at stake? And in marketing, and I would dare even say in other social sciences as well, what is at stake is our reputations and our jobs, right? So because we are in the social sciences, some of us, we have to be very creative. We have to be very counterintuitive. If you are not counterintuitive in social sciences, your research is uninteresting and therefore is not likely to be published, is not likely to be talked about, is not likely to be shared. And so evidence is not enough, right? Like you've heard already before, it's all about the story. So let me kind of set the stage before I go into some examples of one of my projects that helped me be with you here today. So imagine 150 hopeful PhD marketing students coming into a conference and interviewing for very competitive positions, right? How do you set yourself apart? Everybody comes in with some written stuff, very good research, solid methodology, a lot of words, right? However, writing is not enough. So what might help you get your research some visibility, and I am a marketing scholar after all, is visualizing your findings and visualizing your data, okay? So here are just a couple of examples from a meta-analysis, right? Just an example of how you might use images to capture the attention of your audience when you're setting up the research problem, right? So in this particular case, in the research problem that I was investigating, there was a lot of other published research. Like I said, meta-analysts might be perceived sometimes as a little bit lazy. But there was a big debate in the field, okay? Do online reviews in particular and ratings cause any change in company sales? Yes or no, and how, right? And so what we essentially did, me and my co-authors, is we performed a meta-analysis. We took 100 published studies, and we statistically pulled that together to come up with answers that we claimed finally settled the debate. Finally, we have a story. It's a compelling story, right? We used nice visuals, interesting primary as well as secondary data, right? And the story was successful. So just a couple more examples here. It's not really about the content. It's really just about how you could visualize some of your results to make them more appealing to your audiences. So in this particular case, you can see a comparison, right? Which is very effective. Visuals, images help people better understand what you've done, especially if you find some different results. It helps them kind of compare and contrast. So in this research, what we did is we used this really cool website that's called I now even can't remember what it's called. Let me see, the Wayback Machine. There we go. Has anybody heard of the Wayback Machine? Yes? Some of you have. It's this really cool website where you can go and see what other websites looked like back in time. So it essentially allows you to travel back in time. So we wanted to see, hey, what did Amazon look like back in 2003? And we found some interesting differences, right? We found, okay, if you were looking through Amazon in 2003, the online reviews, believe it or not, were all the way at the end of the page, right? As opposed to today, 2012, for example, where it's all the way on the top. And we claimed, hey, that might have actually played some effect in how online reviews were effective before versus how they're effective today, right? Let me give you another example. So here, we used this very simple table to show the difference in our results between social media websites and e-commerce websites, right? We wanted to say, hey, depending on the type of product or service, online reviews might impact sales differently. This is how it's going to take place on e-commerce sites like eBay. This is how it's going to take place on social media sites like Twitter, right? So again, it's about telling that story. Not a lot of folks that I interviewed with were interested in my p-values or t-statistics or my ANOVAs or my hierarchical linear modeling. They believed the method was correct. It was all about the story. And not even writing was enough. It was all about capturing their attention and being able to kind of be interesting and be different. Here's another example of how you can visualize some of your results. Use images to create essentially that story, help people interpret your results. So one of the results, for example, that we found is that the volume of online reviews, not the average rating, right? So that was a little bit counterintuitive, which helped. It was the volume that helped increase sales. So if there's a lot of reviews on a product, it's going to sell better, right? But not the average rating necessarily. And so to kind of illustrate that, we use this image of the mass, of a lot of people, right? Trying to kind of make it easier for the audience to understand, oh, it's really about the bandwagon. It's really about the volume of folks. Here's another example. So this was all about trying to emphasize a counterintuitive result. So we think that negative ratings are going to be really hurtful for product sales, but it's actually not necessarily the case. Or it's the case, but for very specific types of products, right? So again, it's about forcing your audience, essentially, to think about how your research is different, how your research is unique, how your research is better, right? It's rarely going to be the story about methodology. It's going to be the story about how you're different. And so, because I'm a marketing scholar, I will say our research, and especially using these kinds of visuals, help position ourselves in the minds of our audience, right? Using these kinds of tools help you create a certain perception, not just of yourself and your project, but also the institution that you represent, right? You could do it well or you could do it poorly. Just imagine, like I said, 150 hopeful students just trying to get a job. And imagine being one of those professors that is sitting for 5 days in a hotel interviewing all of these folks thinking, I'm just sick of PowerPoints and slides and stories and research. How do you make yourself stand out, right? So my message would be at the end, use data visualization, use it wisely, use it to your advantage, and do not be fooled in thinking that good research is all that it takes, right? It's all about how you create that story and how you create the perception of being different and of being unique. Okay. So with that, I conclude. Thank you.
Okay, so now we have an opportunity for questions, and I have a few, but if audience members have questions, I'm happy to jump right in and have you start asking questions of our panelists. Is there anyone who would like, this is one of my fantasies, I'll pretend I'm Jerry Springer and walk around. We don't have any guards though to hold people back, so don't get mean or anything. But does anybody have questions they want to ask?
Did you notice None of the students laughed at that? I think they knew Jerry's brain.
Well, I'm gonna start out then. I'm going to start out. So, Dr. Brent, you do a lot of work across disciplines. When you're getting into a new discipline, what do you do to make sure that you're getting the good stuff and that you understand, what conversations they're really having?
That's a great question. So it's really hard. I don't think, can I stand up there?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I'll sit down again, I promise. So, just because I like to see the people that I'm talking to. So, the question was, when you're doing interdisciplinary research, how do you gauge, or can you say that part again?
Yeah, when you get into a new area, how do you make sure that you're getting the good information and finding the active live conversations?
Right, so as someone who's engaged in philosophical research, I look for colleagues in other disciplines who to me seem to be also engaging from within their own discipline in philosophical research. So that's, I think so. Barry had a point on his slide, which may or may not have been a joke, about how he's asking a question about whether there's really nothing in the vacuum or something like that, right? So I look for colleagues who are asking what I see as philosophical questions within their discipline. So in my case, it would be neuroscience and psychology. And if we can find some sort of overlap in our common interests as philosophers, right, then I would proceed in engaging with them in some sort of collective work, if that helps. Yeah.
So,
Don't clap.
we'll clap for everybody again one more time at the end. So Dr. Sheridan Sperber, when you're deciding on what methods, I know there is the idea that, well, we want the right method to do the right thing, but how do you do that? Does it just occur to you, or do you have a process for figuring out what the right method might be?
Yeah, that's a great, complicated question, but I think that the nutshell answer is that you spend a lot of time in classes reading work that other people have done and deciding whether or not you think it's good or bad. And a lot of that time in grad school is spent thinking about what the information they've collected can really tell us, whether that's from focus group data or survey data or historical archives, or some kind of metadata, or you scrape data from the internet or something like that. Scholars use various types of data to make claims. And as a scholar growing up in grad school, you spend a lot of time analyzing what other people have done and trying to decide and argue about whether or not the claims they make and the story they tell is really justified by the information or the data that they present and the analysis that they've conducted on that data. So there are, ways to tell in each case. I would say there's rough consensus on a lot of those different methods about when they're more appropriate or not. But the process of learning those things is a lot of what grad school is.
Yes.
If I stand fully up, this is Doug Hesse on the floor down here. I'd be curious to hear people talk about their specific writing practices. One draft, perfect. One draft, okay. Second draft is great. Just tell a little bit about how a manuscript comes into being.
First, you stare at a blank screen for about, the amount of time can be different depending on whether there's a deadline or not. If there's a deadline, then it's like, what, 2 days before the deadline, then you start to actually have words that come out. So I'm exaggerating to some degree, but personally speaking, I'm not very I have no real method that I just kind of struggle with it. I don't know, somebody said writing is simple, you just sit down at a typewriter and open a vein, right? I forget who that was. Is it, I don't know.
Don't try that.
That was a philosophical statement, I think. So, yeah, I don't know. I just confessing my struggle with it, I guess. And so, but as a result, everything you start off with sucks, right? So, you gotta revise it a whole lot before you show it to anybody whose opinion you care about, and then you've got to really show it to people, right? No matter how great a thing I've got that I've written, whenever I show it to somebody who's got a qualified opinion, there's something that was not, that could have been improved. So, that's my 2 cents on that.
You saw me pulling in the mic. Not one, not two, not three, more like 150 versions of the document. And not only because I was collaborating with other people, it's because what you write at the beginning may suck. And so you really need to go back and revise that. There was a wonderful picture that I took of my own paper after just a couple of days of not looking at it. And I edited it with a red pen, and if you can see, it looked pretty much like this. Essentially, almost every word really was highlighted in red, scratched. There were so many mistakes that I found in my own manuscript, just because I'd given myself a couple of days of not processing that manuscript. So different styles, I would certainly say share it with other people, not too early, but definitely, at least for me, the key has been revise it often and revise it a lot.
All right, so I'm just curious into the stage before the research is how do you come up with your questions that you want to pursue? And then I'm sure you have a bunch of questions. What criteria does that single question have to pass for you to actually pursue it?
That's an excellent question that we're all still trying to answer. I think one of the things, well, okay, where do the questions come from? For me and folks in my discipline and other social sciences like sociology and anthropology, I think a lot of it is from your own experience, sort of growing up and your experience listening to the news in the morning. And I always tell my students that, you're not an expert in what the entire discourse of history or anthropology or sociology or political science has said on a topic, but what you do have is an incredible advantage over all of those scholars who've come before you and put forth really grand theses. You're living in a world they didn't see. So you know all kinds of things and have access to all kinds of information just really through your own daily experience, right? And observing what's going on in the world that the greats didn't have. And so, you can think about what you know and what you see that seems different or changing or compelling to you. And once you know a discipline well, sometimes you just realize that that's contradicts something that was conventional wisdom, right? Or something like that. So that's one way to come up with a question. And in terms of how you vet what questions are worth pursuing, that's tough, but one thing, especially in fields like ours, where you are relying on data, whether that's focus groups that you go out and have with people or things you find on the internet or whatever, you're relying on data to make a claim. And so thinking about what that question is, what you would need to prove or show to have people believe that problem really exists and that you're thinking about how the world works in relation to that problem is right, then you have to figure out if you can access that data. And sometimes you can't, or you don't have enough money, so you write a grant and save that project on the back burner for next year. That's some stuff.
Well, I would say at least in our discipline of marketing, one main qualifier would be, is it something that's different enough, or that you can tell a story that's different enough from what's been already available out there? If not, the research, as interesting as it might be, might not get published, might not even get the time of day. So is it something that's unique enough, different enough? Can you show the same thing with a different method, a simpler method? Can you show something counterintuitive? Can you show that some previous results on whatever topic actually do not work? Can you show that they don't work and identify in which settings it will not work? Right? So there are multiple pathways to success, I'd say.
Yeah, in physics anyway, I mean, it's fairly essential to know what sort of, where the frontier of knowledge is. Mm-hmm. So you've got to be up on some kind of field, right? You've got to have done your homework to know what's going on. Because again, no matter how interesting a question you come up with, if it's something that has either already been done or is utterly tangential to whatever is going on with everybody else. It could be either a totally lost cause or really hard row to hoe, right? And then from that point, though, different people have really different approaches. There are some people who are so visionary that they just automatically then know what they think the next step for the field should be, and they go and do it, or figure out how to do it. And I'm not that smart, I don't think. Or I just work differently, where I just have to kind of look around at what tools are available to me and what ideas are in my head and around, and put something together and figure out what's a new direction to go. And sometimes I'm lucky and the new direction is something that's really compelling and interesting and it all works, and other times maybe it's not so great. But so yeah, different people are different ways, but I'm sort of a creature of environment in that sense, where I've got to have something around that I can see, that I can figure out how to use and what to do. And so I'm pretty strongly affected by the tools that I've got around in a sort of broad sense. And, you know, sometimes it works great, and other times not.
Can I ask a question about, so were you asking the question from the perspective of our existing research practices, or were you asking the question from, hey, I'm a student, what do I write about? Or you see what I'm saying? No, good. Good teacher right here, everyone. Okay, so I thought you were asking, as a student, how do I find the questions I need to ask to drive my own research as a student in a specific class? That's how I heard you. But so that's not what you were asking? You were asking us in our own particular research?
I was interested in both.
Yeah,
so I
yeah.
thought I wouldn't.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
I thought I'd leave it open so I could do
Right.
whatever you guys would tell me.
Right. Smart. Okay, so I'll interpret it as the imagining from your perspective. So I would think, how do you come up with the questions that drive your own undergraduate research? Most of it's going to be based on what you currently think you know and what you currently think you believe about the world and what you currently think is interesting to you. And the way to get to that is to try to experience as many things as you possibly can in an academic context and find out what things sort of get you and speak to you and what questions you're like, holy moly, that's amazing. I don't know why triangles aren't made of matter. What the, something like that, right? Or what is emptiness, Barry Zink, right? Like, what?
Triangles are made of matter.
Yeah, no, they're not made of matter. Barry's wrong. We didn't also talk about disciplinary differences between epistemological pursuits, which would be really fun as to why. Anyways,
See, but the triangle that you think
triangles aren't made of matter.
the triangle you think is not made of matter is made of neurons in your brain, and your neurons are matter.
This is an alternative meta-analysis.
Yes.
Stop us now, please.
Hi, so I'm really curious as to what does evidence look like in philosophy? Like, how are you?
Let the record show he just swore underneath his breath.
My neurons did, Barry. My neurons did.
Right. It's real. Your neurons
How are you
real.
going about
You hate your neurons.
supporting your question, and what is thinking? Is it active or passive?
Thank you. That's a really hard question. So, in philosophy, you justify, you're asking a question about the evidence. So what is the evidence? So part of what makes philosophy, I think, a blended intellectual pursuit is that the evidence can be both subjective, from your own perspective as a human thinker, not a bunch of neurons, and also what the bunch of neurons say you are, and why you might engage with that kind of evidence, which could be objective evidence. So for me, it depends on the topic of your inquiry, but the evidence can be both subjective and not subjective, or intersubjective and objective. But always you're going to be arguing. You're going to be defending your claims with reasons, and you're going to have multiple drafts of your written work, and you're going to send it out to many friends, and it's going to be very collaborative. And part of what you're going to do is try to convince them of the truth of your claim through rhetoric and reason and argumentation. And the evidence can be drawn from pretty much anywhere in philosophy, pretty much anywhere. So thanks.
So my question is, I guess, more directed towards like marketing and whatnot. But when presenting your slideshows and whatnot, you have a whole load of information, and so on that slideshow, you want to capture your audience's attention right away. So you do the visualization, you tell the story, whatnot. But how do you know from your collected data what to show and what to put to the side and be like, oh, I can maybe explain that with my words?
You have a really great T-shirt on.
Sure. I'll jump at it. Just simply because you said marketing. So good practice is not to include everything on your slide, not to include too many words, include as many visuals as possible. Other than that, I would say presentation styles and the preferences of your audience might be different. So if you were looking at my slides and thinking, that's a lot of information, let me tell you, there was a lot more that didn't make it on the slide, but I was ready to talk about if people asked questions. You try to, I would say the good strategy would be to try to show the most surprising, the most unexpected, the most counterintuitive results, and let that spark conversation. And if your audience wants more information on whatever point, they will ask, if that tackles the question. Please.
Yeah, I would add, that could be, this is a long conversation, but one way to think about your question is like, how do people learn? So if you're trying to teach in a class with slides or present a lecture where you're trying to convince people that you've found out some stuff about the world you want to basically teach them, or you want them to come away believing and remembering, then, you know, it depends, but if it's a big idea and you can think of a metaphor for it and have a picture of that, that's way better than trying to write out all the stuff you have to say about that idea on the slide, right? Because that may be one other way they remember the information. So that's kind of one way to think about it. The other thing I want to say is that for the project that we did, where it's qualitative, that's like literally the only exception in my experience of slide use, where having a bunch of words on a slide is a good idea. So if you're quoting something where the words or the structure of the language really matters, so this may be true in English too, then it's often worth putting the paragraph up there and slowly letting people take it in and pointing out what you want to point out or whatever. We didn't have time to do that with some of these quotes, but that is what a lot of qualitative researchers would be emphasizing, right? So yeah, there's probably no right answer, but there are better and worse practices.
I want to, I think, a little bit disagree with Anna about the counterintuitive stuff, because you have to both present data that everybody's going to agree with, or let's just say information. You have to first present information that everyone agrees with, to show like a common sense that you're in the same club with everybody else and we're all on the same page. And then from that standpoint, where you have established trust with whatever community you're talking about, then you shock them about something. And that's the way to really move the needle. Because if you just come in and say a bunch of shocking things without first proving that you're sort of one of the group, then there's going to be a bunch of people who are just going to say, that's a wacko. I just heard from a crazy person. This happens all the time in physics, really. It really does, right? So you know, people come in and you're like, I don't know what this person's talking about. They're like, they've either never read a paper in this field, or they don't care, or where'd they get their degree, or I don't know what. I mean, there's all sorts of, and some of that argument and reasoning is sort of useful. A lot of it's not, but it's the way that the world works. And so you first have to establish some trust and common language, if you will, about whatever it is you're talking about. And then you have to do something really new and really beyond what somebody has thought about. And if you can do that, then that's how you really crack their little minds open and get something new. That's just...
I only partially agree. For the interest of this panel and making it interesting for you guys, I'd say we could do that with the way we present the research problem. So if we can agree that our research problem is, yes, important, yes, there hasn't been a great answer to it, maybe we can agree on that and belong to the same club just based on that. But let me show you why what I'm doing is entirely unique and different and the best, then you need to hire me. Helps, kind of, yes? Consensus?
Yeah, sure.
I think we also might be seeing that there are actually disciplinary differences in the degree to which you do those things, too, yes.
Yeah, for sure.
That's a good topic.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Questions? Come on, be brave.
I had a question actually specific for the SCC project. You said that there was no good model for social change, and I'm curious if in your research and in your data analysis you found a solution to that or a way that could work.
It is such a great question. Yeah, I would love to be someone who came up with a model that works for social change. That's way beyond my goal. What I was trying to say, maybe I misspoke, but is there's no great service delivery model for a variety of different types of services, or what some people call blended services, or ways to basically try to address the needs of people facing systematic barriers and complicated situations. And so, so to keep it short, I would say there is literature. So this is in my discipline. This is something that I think you were sort of speaking to. But we talk about a literature review, right? So you saw I had some names and dates on those slides, just a few, given that you guys are not, really hard-nosed, nasty academics trying to tear this paper apart. But those names and dates refer to papers where people have done other research or done meta-analysis of all the research or whatever, and so there's a body of research out there across fields that talks about the extent to which different models over time have been tried and to the degree to which they've succeeded. But you should study sociology if you like that question.
Going off of that question about prison and everything, I've heard about how maybe America is so focused on punishment in prisons and everything, and rather people should be focusing on rehabilitation, actual rehabilitation in other places in the world, and it's been a lot more successful. Has there been a lot of research that points to that? And if there is, why hasn't it caused effect or anything? Makes sense.
Such a good question. One thing that's happening with your question is you're shining a light on the limitations of academic research. Because, there is a bunch of research on that, and you're right, especially from different countries. So a lot of countries in Europe have very different penal systems and approaches to crime and punishment, or mental health and rehabilitation and addiction. We're in a moment where there's a lot of push for change, especially around addiction issues right now. This is a moment of transformation in the discourse. Where that goes is an open question and can be affected by a lot of things. But there is research out there that shows that's never enough. The question of political will and whether people are mobilized and all those other things are important factors. But I think something that your question points to too is this idea, Anna was talking a lot about what's interesting or new or novel. And so in the social sciences, I like to think that one of the criteria we use is also relevance, right? So sometimes we may occasionally accuse philosophers of doing things that are very esoteric and may not actually affect the real world, right? But there's a place for that too, and it all comes together. But in my discipline, that question of relevance, right, is important. So that body of research really hopes to make the impact that you're talking about.
Relevance. The question of relevance is a philosophical question. Thank you.
I agree.
It all comes back to philosophy.
Yeah. There's no economist, but you could say that the question of relevance is an economic question, too.
I'm curious about collaboration. I noticed Dr. Zink had a slide with all those people in it. And I come out of English and literature, which is probably like philosophy. It's me and some books. I might collaborate by having friends read drafts or go out for a beer and talk about stuff, but I don't really research with other people. And I think that might be peculiar to the humanities, but I don't really have a question. I just want to comment on what is collaboration? Why is it more important in some fields than not in others? Or maybe it is in the humanities, but it looks different. What's it like to research with a lot of other people who are doing this stuff for you, and then you have to write it up?
Sure. So that's a great question. And there's lots of ways to approach it, but I could just discuss sort of how one of my recent collaborations formed, actually a couple of them were both this way. So, you know, I had an idea about something with this one line of research was leading toward an idea where we were wondering what types of material spin currents could flow in. And all of a sudden it occurred to me that if we had a particular type of material to test using our technique, that we might be able to show something really very significant. But in that particular case, I just didn't have the equipment or the expertise I needed to make that thing happen. I mean, I could say, you know, if I could do the research just in my mind, I would say amorphous yttrium iron garnet appear here, but I can't do that. But I can do that with a collaborator, because I know the guy at CSU who grows the stuff, and I can just say, call him up on the phone and say, hey, I've got this really great idea. Can you help us out with this? And he's like, yeah, sounds fantastic. And so we sent him some stuff, and then they sent the stuff back to us, and then we measured it here, and then we were able to show this. Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's a tradition in our field. That, yeah, if you have somebody who contributes intellectually to a piece of work, there's always a little bit of trying to decide what makes enough of an intellectual contribution and not, so that can get kind of sticky, sort of what is authorship or not. In that particular case, absolutely clear that that person deserved to be an author on the paper, and definitely is. And not just that person, but also the postdoc who works with that person, who's the one who actually did the stuff in the lab, right? Who's the one who knew where, you know, all the knobs and buttons to push to make sure that it happened the right way and not the wrong way. That person also is making an intellectual contribution, and that name is on the paper. And so sometimes it's about availability of equipment. Sometimes it's about having a totally new idea or experience. But, you know, there's not that much that actually one person can do when it comes to physics anyway. And I think there's actually not that much that one person ever did in physics either. There's this concept of like, oh, well, Einstein was such a genius, or, you know, these discoveries are due to Marie Curie. But they were always working with a lot of different people. They were always getting ideas from a bunch of different people. So, yeah, I don't know. Lately, anyway, I think we're doing a more honest job of communicating about how many people get involved in the sort of work that we do. Now, how many people get involved in writing is also kind of right, because you've got a bunch of co-authors and you write one manuscript, and sometimes you really do have a bunch of different people writing different pieces of a manuscript. That could be, yeah. Anyway.
I mean, that doesn't get any better outside after you're done with school and you have to work in groups together?
No. No, it
There's
gets way
variation.
worse. I'll tell you what, I mean, the amount of pain and suffering associated with the manuscript definitely goes up with the number of authors on the page. And also, I think it also involves the seniority of the people who are there, right? So I'm lately involved in a review paper that has about 30 different people, all of whom are way more famous than I am. And that means that there's a lot of really dumb stuff that's every once in a while has to happen, and everybody thinks they're too busy to do it. I'm just gonna leave that right there.
Are you typically surprised by the results of your research and have to come back to your topic sentence a couple times?
Someone down there, and was that for me, or for everybody?
Are you typically surprised by the results of your research, and do you have to go back to your thesis sentence a few times?
It's most fun when I'm surprised by the results of my research, and most exciting when I'm surprised by the results of the research. Sometimes we have an idea and we do an experiment and it just reinforces what we already knew. And if we're the only people that really know that and are busy trying to communicate that to the world, then that can still be worthwhile to do. But it's certainly much more exciting when we go and measure something and something totally different happens. Or the thing that we thought would happen happened, but it happened in a different way than we thought it was going to happen. And that, yeah, so am I always surprised? No, but I'm lucky enough, I guess, that I'm often surprised by it, and that's really great.
I'd even add to that, at least in marketing, it's very hard to build new theory from scratch. So even if you get some surprising results, you have to be able to go back to your hypotheses and link it to an existing theory in that you extend it and show some moderating factors in which, so situations in which the theory applies, situations in which the theory does not apply. But if it's entirely, if the results are entirely out of the blue, it's probably not going to get very good feedback from peer reviewers, and it's not going to get very successful.
Yeah, certainly the more shocking a result, the higher the burden of proof rises, right? So if you've got something that you're trying to show that is really counter to what most people have thought, you've got to really, really hammer on it to make sure that you're making as strong an argument, and you really have thought of everything that you can think of to make it really compelling to people. And a lot of that comes down to the writing too, because you show the data, but you also have to really explain why it is significant and communicate how you've done everything you think you can do to prove that you're right. That comes down to how well you can communicate about it in writing a lot of the time too.
Well, not seeing an eager hand up, I'm just going to say that we have the room for about 5 more minutes, and maybe it's a good to just leave a little bit of time if someone wants to come up and talk to any of our panelists individually and shyly, and not ask your question in front of everyone. Have a chance to do that. Let's give our panelists a big hand. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.